everyone. We've got a nice, intimate group here. So, my name is Hadas Gold. I am a reporter for CNN, and I'm really excited to be here to talk about populism, human rights, technology, how they all go together. We have an excellent panel here. These people have years of experience across many different fields, and instead of me introducing them, they can do it much better themselves. So I would love if we could just go down the line and say who you are, where you came from, and why you're here.
So, hello everyone. My name is Maryam Al-Khawaja. I am the special advisor on advocacy with the Gulf Center for Human Rights, and I also work with a bunch of NGOs on digital security training and other stuff. But originally I'm a Bahraini human rights defender. I was part of the people that organized for the uprising in Bahrain in 2011 as part of the mass protest that happened across the Middle East and North Africa. And I also ended up spending some time in prison because of my activism.
Neal?
My name's Neal, Katyal. I run the Supreme Court practice at a big global law firm called Hogan, Lovells, and I teach constitutional law at Georgetown. I got into human rights back when I was teaching at Georgetown. I took the Bush administration on in what became my first Supreme Court case about Guantanamo and won that and struck down the military trials there is unconstitutional. I think I was like 33 back then. And from that, I went on to become President Obama's top courtroom lawyer, defending the government against all sorts of things. And now I am leading the fight against President Trump on the travel ban. I represent the state of Hawaii, and the president has, as we'll talk about, done all sorts of horrible things, and I'm suing him in courts.
Symone?
Hi, I'm Symone Sanders. I am happy to be here with my colleague, Hadas. I am a CNN political commentator. And before that, I was the National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders' presidential run in 2016.
So I just wanted to jump right in. And I think one of the first things we need to do is some definitions here. Because when I was preparing for this, I was looking at what does populism mean versus other categories that we're hearing thrown about, like nationalism or something like that. So when you look at the dictionary, populism talks about how it's for the everyman. It's rising up the common person. But what do you think populism has become, and how does it fit in with the nationalist movements and all of that?
I mean, I'll say, Bernie Sanders, he was an economic populist. And I think it's important to understand that I think populism is a thin ideology that always has to be mixed with a thick ideology. So while Bernie was an economic populist, someone like Donald Trump his populism is mixed with a little nationalism, a little racism, a little ethnocentrism, just a little bit, just a dash of that. So I think populism, there's types of dirty populism, if you will, and that's what I would ascribe to President Trump. But populism is really a thin ideology that always has to be mixed with a thick ideology.
Neal, do you think that populism is necessarily at its core xenophobic in that way, or?
No, I mean, I think sometimes the appeals to populism come out as xenophobic, but I actually think, in my perspective, it depends on the country, but at least for me, like America, my parents came to America from India because of the populism there, that it was a welcoming country to foreigners. And, obviously there's all sorts of problems with America, going back to its original sin of slavery, which we've never come to grapple with fully. But at the end of the day, I still think, there's a good core group of the popular heart of America is good at its core and doesn't like these things that we see, whether it's in Charlottesville or the stuff going on against Muslims.
And so, Maryam, why do we sometimes see this clashing between populism or nationalism and human rights? Like you would think when you read the definition, sounds like it would all go well together. So where does it go wrong?
Well, I think it's the same thing as we see with many other issues. Just like tech, you have people who use it for good and people who use it for bad. And I think it's the same way when a group of people come together and they feel or believe that they represent the common good of all people, then they give themselves the right to take on specific opinions or, do specific things because they feel it's for the greater good. So like, as was mentioned, the marches we saw in Charlottesville and so on. But then you can contrast that with the Women's March in Washington, D.C., which was also about populism. It was about, human rights for all. It was about women's rights. It was about trans rights. It was about all these different things. And in a sense, that was also about populism, about the greater good for the public. So I think there is a contrast. There is populism that is positive and populism that is negative.
So, Symone, as you said, the Sanders campaign was thought to be more of a populist movement. A lot of people contrasted it with the Trump campaign, said they're kind of feeding into the same energies. Why then do you think people associated the more maybe negative aspects of populism or nationalism with the Trump campaign versus the Sanders campaign?
Because I think those are the elements that Donald Trump chose to highlight and run on, if you will. And so negative elements that people often associate with populism, such as the racism, the white nationalism, which is what his campaign really brought out, those are things that Donald Trump propped up on a pedestal. We weren't talking about white nationalism on the campaign that I worked for, nor were we propping up and aiding and abetting and perpetuating the systems of oppression that have locked people of color out of so many systems. And that's why I think it's really important for us to understand that populism can be a good thing. But in so many places across the world, we have seen the negative elements of populism highlighted. And so Bernie Sanders chose to lean, like everything about Bernie is about economics. Like the basis of everything he does is we in America lived in a rigged economy that's kept in place by a system of corrupt campaign finance. And because we live in a rigged economy, X can be anything. X can be, because we live in a rigged economy, racism. Because we live in a rigged economy, sexism, ageism. And that is with the lens through which he saw his campaign. Concurrently, I think Donald Trump saw his campaign and his presidency through a lens of which includes like the preservation of culture, of heritage, and that culture, that heritage is not speaking to everybody. That's a very specific culture, very specific heritage, and he has a very specific narrowed lane through which he views his presidency, for whom he is put there to work for.
Here's a question, though. I mean, and this is posed by a lot of people who are talking about preserving, for example, United States white culture. They're saying white males are now, their life expectancy have gone down. What's wrong with being a nationalist? What's wrong with being proud of your people or your country and wanting to protect that economically or protect that from outside forces?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you're a nationalist but you're not bringing harm to others, then of course there's no problem. But the problem is, and this is one of the first things you learn in human rights, is that your rights stop where other people's rights begin. So as long as what you're doing does not entrench on other people's rights or force them into anything, then it's fine. Then you do, what your prerogative is to do. But I think another thing that's somewhat problematic is that a lot of times the negative populism gets a lot more attention, whether it's in the media or otherwise, than positive populism. And I'm talking, for example, we've had movements in the Middle East, for example, that was anti-terrorism, anti-radicalization, extremism, and those protests, those marches and so on, they don't get much attention. But then when you have a movement that's very negative, in its populism, that's when the media latches on, and that's when it gets a lot of attention. And I think that's also part of the problem.
And I would add to that, I think that's great. I think the other piece of it is it's just incomplete. When you talk about preserving culture or make America great again, it's not making the entire vision of America great or thinking back to our old American traditions. It's one certain tradition, and that just elides so much of the greatness about our fabric in America as a country. I mean, our national motto is e pluribus unum, out of many one. And you'll never hear Donald Trump saying anything quite like that. I mean, and so, if we want to talk about celebrating history, it's not just a white history. There's an African-American history. There's an immigrant history. There's so much richness to what America is about. And this just kind of truncates it and makes it this one thing.
So there was some criticism in the past 8 years that the President Obama and his paid too much attention to the rest of the world or to other things than to the United States. You hear that he was you hear people say this in a negative way, that he was a globalist and that the globalists are the bad people. Do you think that's sort of the more international aspect, as we become a more globalized place where everything's interconnected, has contributed to this sort of backlash against, as we were talking about now, human rights or immigrants or refugees or anything like that?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, I think that what globalism is doing is that it's threatening privilege. It's not necessarily threatening nationalism or threatening a feeling of this is a country that I belong to. It's about privilege, and that's why usually the people who come out against globalism, they're against refugees and so on, a lot of times it comes with that privilege that they feel they might lose if there are more people coming into the country. And, you know, I grew up in Denmark, and I saw this. We were subjected to racism on a daily basis growing up there. And I remember that a lot of it was about that. It was about, you know, the Muslims are taking over, the brown people are taking over. And so it plays into that fear of, well, we are going to start losing our privileges if they become equal citizens. And that's, I think, part of the fear that grows, and that a lot of politicians play on to get votes for parliament or for government.
So, Neal, you work in the arena of the law. What's the best way to convince people to be more open to these types of issues of human rights and of immigrants' rights? Is it through law or is it through society?
Yeah, I don't think the law can do that much. I mean, the law can take the rough edges off. So President Trump will have a refugee ban. I'll walk into court, get the thing struck down. But, you know, there is a deeper cultural issue that you're talking about. Even whenever I won one of those cases against the refugee or travel bans, I would get hundreds of emails saying, go back to your country. And I would respond, I'm actually in my country. I was born in America, you know. But people can't see that if they see you on TV. They just see a foreigner. And that cultural thing has got to, you know, that's a much deeper thing, and it happens at the presidential campaign level, but it happens at dinner tables. It happens over Facebook and things like that, too.
Symone, how do you change somebody's mind and promote and get them to be more accepting when they might be, you know, living in a situation where they've lost their job? They're literally training their replacements who are brought in from Mexico, and they're training them, and they're going to lose their job once the jobs go to Mexico. They are trying to apply to college, and they can't find scholarships, but they see that there's all these programs for other groups, and they might feel that they don't have that sort of access. So what do you say to that type of person? Why convince them?
Yeah, I think it's coming to a place of understanding. I think a lot of times we approach conversations trying to win someone over to our side, when it's really about coming to a basis of understanding. Look, there's a place in America called McDowell County, West Virginia, which is one of the poorest counties in America. The folks in McDowell County, West Virginia, are dealing with some of the same things that people in downtown Chicago, Illinois are dealing with. Some of the same thing people in Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is a rural area. But the rhetoric has made us feel as though that they are not. The economy is an everybody issue. Everybody wants a job. Mm-hmm. I haven't happened upon that one person that would say I would rather not work. So part of it is about changing the narrative and approaching the conversation with some understanding. But so much of, particularly in America, of the last year and a half, 2 years, in our presidential and our political language, we have heard this rhetoric of that, these white working class workers are losing their jobs, when the working class is really browning. Like, by 2032, the working class will be majority people of color. By 2040, America will be majority people of color. When we talk about the working class, we're actually really talking about people of color. But when you hear working class, you automatically think white working class people in America. And so part of it, I think it is changing the narrative and being very intentional with our words. But everybody is dealing with the same thing.
I also wanted to add, to that point, I think, one, there's a problem between this shift that we're seeing between left and right-wing politicians and people becoming confused about who's what. And I mean, this is something that we saw in America, but I'll use Denmark as an example. Mm-hmm. In Denmark, we now have a right-wing government in place. And part of it is because the Social Democrats, who are the left-wing, who had the government before, their entire election campaign was on anti-immigration because they were trying to compete with the right-wing politicians for votes. And so people started not being able to tell the difference between the left-wing and the right-wing political parties. And so suddenly it becomes, well, what difference does it make who I vote for? And I think, in a sense, from the work that I've done and the studies that I've done on American U.S. politics as well, it's part of the same thing, is that the Democrats also had a lot of failings where people stopped trusting the system as much, which is why Trump, when he came in and he said, I'm against the system, I'm someone outside the system, I will bring you something completely different, that was something that appealed to a lot of people. And I think that's also part of the issue, is that there needs to be the situation of, when we're talking about whether it's a right-wing or a left-wing government in place, we need to have a foundation that respects and solidifies respect of human rights. So that whether you have a far-right or a far-left government in place, there are some things that shouldn't be changed regardless of who is in power. And that's respect of universal human rights.
Symone was talking about the economics, and you come from a different background than the States and Europe. Do you find the same sort of economic push behind some of the unrest we've seen, some of the anti-immigrant reaction we've seen in Europe as well? Is this a common thread?
Oh, definitely. I mean, in Denmark, the people who were voting for the Danish People's Party, which is as far right as you can go, and who their entire political party, ideology is built on anti-immigration, anti-refugees, and so on. The people who vote for them are usually from rural areas where they've never seen brown people. And so the areas that are the most mixed, so like Copenhagen, where you have a lot of the immigrants and the refugees, or Aarhus, where it's the same thing, those people are voting for left-wing political parties who are pro-refugees and pro-immigrants. And so you actually see how it's easier for fear-mongering to happen when politicians focus on areas where people haven't actually met people of color, because that's how you can make people more afraid.
So I completely agree. There's an ignorance component to this, which is so strong. Like if you ask people in Kansas, how close is the nearest mosque? They'll all be within they'll think it's 5 miles or 10 miles away. There are almost no mosques in Kansas. If you ask them, where, is Sharia law being enforced? They'll say, yes, it's being enforced. The Sharia law is coming to get us. Of course not. So there's this whole kind of drama that's been built up about this, which, I don't think our media and I don't think our electronic, Facebook platforms and the like have done a very good job dispelling. Instead, they've been siloing us off into different echo chambers.
So, yeah, please.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I think back to, in one of the last, not the last presidential election, but the midterm, the prior midterm election. In Wisconsin, one of the top issues was border control. Because folks, literally, there were ads that were being run talking about Mexicans coming in and taking your jobs. Wisconsin is up here. The border with Mexico is way down here. It just doesn't translate. But there were people who are literally going to the polls saying, I don't want Mexicans taking my jobs. And I'm like, oh, we need a little educational component. So absolutely. I mean, Neal hit on the social media part of it. And I mean, if you know anything about Facebook, no shade to the Facebook people, and I've said this to them, but Facebook is literally designed so that if you do not like something, it will not show you anything you don't like. You can literally click a button that says, never show this to me ever again, and you won't see it. And so Facebook reinforces what we think we know. And that's dangerous. So when you talk about silos, the problem is that we do not have messages that can break across silos. And so some of the work that I'm currently doing now with a group called Priorities USA is we are working on really building a real digital infrastructure and finding viral messages that can cut across silos. Because otherwise, we're just going to become more entrenched in what we think we know.
So we are at Web Summit, obviously, and this is a great segue into talking about how technology can work to help human rights, can work to really, I mean, if you think about it, capturing the energy of this populist movement maybe towards something that works for more people, because at its core, I think everybody agrees they want everybody to have a good job and have freedom. I mean, some people might not be for that, but I think that a lot of times the people who are for populism or nationalism are sometimes painted in a really negative light when it might just be that they are trying to further themselves. So as we're talking about, some of it is education. So this is a big topic in the United States and in Europe right now. What's the responsibility of these social media companies? They're independent companies, they're for profit, they can do what they want. So why should we be trying to push any sort of regulations on them?
Well, I mean, so we've had conversations actually with Twitter about this issue, and we've also been reaching out to Facebook. And I'm part of a tech community that's also a human rights tech community, and so we do a lot of these conversations, or we try to have a lot of these conversations. And part of it is also, where do you draw the line, right? So yes, of course we believe in freedom of speech because we're human rights activists, and we believe in almost absolute freedom of speech. Wherein I might disagree with what you're saying, but I will fight to the death to protect your right to say it. But at the same time, then where do you draw the line when someone is actually calling for violence or saying something that they know eventually will lead to violence against especially a minority group? And so that's why there's also been this question of, well, should Donald Trump's account be shut down if he's actually trying to cause a war through his tweets, where thousands, if not millions, of people might die. So does Twitter then have a responsibility to shut down Trump's account to try and avoid a war from happening? And so I think the question is also becoming around that. And then, of course, there's the less international discussions on this, where we're also talking about governments outside of Europe and the US, where governments are actually using social media to target activists, to target people on the ground. And so in Bahrain, just to give you a quick example, in 2011, when the revolution started, in Bahrain, the government started taking pictures of the protests, enlarging the photos, and then putting red circles around people's faces for identification, and then they created a hotline for people to call in and identify people for arrest and then subsequently being tortured. And they used Facebook to do this, and it worked. A lot of people were identified and would be arrested the same day when they're identified.
But if it wasn't Facebook, could it have also been just a news photographer, like a CNN broadcast of the protests?
So that's also a question: does a company have a responsibility to shut it down when it's causing directly human rights violations, or not? Is where the question is. And a lot of them would argue, well, if we're not allowing it, then someone else will.
Right.
But then at the same time, Facebook is also shutting down pages of some activists. So, for example, in the Middle East, they shut down some activist groups because they said that it violated community standards in that region, which to me doesn't make any sense, because those are legitimate human rights groups. Even if some people don't think that they should exist, that shouldn't be a good enough reason for Facebook to be taking down those pages.
But can't you also argue that they're operating within the rules of that country, and if they somehow break those rules, they'll be taken offline completely, and then the positive aspects of the social media company can't even be accessed?
But I guess those are the margins that we need to discuss. I think it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said that when there's an unjust law, then we have a responsibility to break that law. And so if we're going to start saying that we're going to work within the unjust laws that these governments put in place, then where does that really leave us? That means, are we going to start operating in places like North Korea or Iran or China as well?
So big picture, I'd say, if we're thinking about, should the governments be regulating these internet platform companies, I think there's kind of three scenarios. One is, the kind of situation in which someone is using Twitter to say, go kill that person or something like that. Obviously, we'd all say that can be regulated. I don't see any problem with that. The second one is when a public figure like Donald Trump says warmongers or something like that. That I have a lot more trouble with, because, I think the remedy to him tweeting in that way is more speech, and to say, that's crazy, we can't let our president do that. But to squelch it seems to me to be dangerous from a democratic perspective. And then the third and the most complicated is the one that Symone's talking about, which is, the channeling of people into different groups, left and right, and so on. And, I'm not sure it's regulation is the answer, but it strikes me there's a core group of people, including, I bet, people on this panel, who actually want to learn from people who think differently. So why the architecture isn't developed in the platform to say, look, introduce me to people who think differently. Maybe you'll build some commonalities over sports or whatever else first before you start to, engage on politics. But, it does strike me that there's a huge missed opportunity for these platforms by sorting everyone into balkanizing us further instead of reaching at our common core, which is actually to learn and understand how other people think.
There's also something to be said about the fact that this is, for all practical purposes, the technology is still really very new, and folks have not really figured out how to harness it, how to use it to the best of our ability. I would say some folks on the right in American politics have done this particularly well. Doesn't make me happy, but they have done it particularly well on the right in conservative politics. They've been able to target people.
They had a little Russian help.
There's a little Russian. Lately, they've had some Russian help, but I mean, the Republicans and the conservatives have been building this infrastructure for the last 5-10 years, whereas on the left and in democratic politics, we have not had that. And so right now in politics, we break people up in demographic boxes. So because I'm a 27-year-old college-educated African-American woman, they put me in a box with other 27-year-old college-educated African-American women. They don't account for if I like cookies or Beyonce. And if I like cookies or Beyonce, could put me and Neal in a box, where me and Neal would never be in a box together. But I know Neal likes cookies and probably Beyonce. And so that is, that's behavioral analytics. And so that is how we go further, not only in our understanding in our politics, but really breaking down some of these silos online. And so companies have been doing this for years, tracking what it is that you like online, building a profile of you, and then that is how they market to you. In our politics, and I would even say in our social justice spaces, that is the next level. But that takes resources, money, and it's very expensive. And if you don't have someone to bankroll this effort to trial and error, then we cannot be successful in this realm.
So one thing I wanted to get to is you're talking about the silos that social media and technology, because now you can curate your life, you can pick your apps, you can do any of that on your own. Some people argue, and maybe Neal, you can talk about this, that certain places like Facebook and Google are becoming public utilities. And we're seeing this in Europe, especially. There's more regulations coming down. In Germany, there's a hate speech law online that within, I think it's 24 hours, even less, if the hate speech is not removed, then the platform is to blame. Neal, what are the gray area legal things? And I know you're speaking to the United States because that's where you work, but that this can get into, and where should we be worried? Like, it can be good to a certain point, but where should we be worried that this is going too far?
Yeah, no, I do think we should be worried, and I'm actually doing this right to be forgotten case here in Europe. It comes out of France and is going to the European Court of Justice. And that's a perfectly good example of where well-meaning, I think, regulation gets way, way amok. And so basically you now have a right in France to say, that article that is being linked to about me, it's embarrassing to me, and you must remove it. It must be eliminated from any Google search engine. So it just literally disappears. It's erasing history. And you can do this for anything that you're named in. That strikes me as a really, really dangerous precedent. And maybe we like it when it's someone who did something embarrassing 20 years ago and you want that not to follow them around. But think of all the bad governments around the world, who would use that power to suppress all sorts of information. And that's going on already as a result of this decision. So I do think there's a way in which we have to worry that well-meaning government regulation, particularly in support of privacy, can have very, very vast consequences, anti-democratic, anti-human rights consequences.
I would say that there's pros and cons to that law. Because, from the field that I work in, and with the vast amount of human rights defenders that I've worked with, I would say that, yes, when it comes to the right to be forgotten for politicians, for public figures, it's problematic. They should not have the right to be forgotten because it's important for people to know what they've done. But for, the things that we've dealt with, we've had governments install cameras in people's homes and take videos of them with their wives or with whatever it is, and then post it online as blackmail. And so people should have the right to be able to get rid of that stuff online. And that's something that we had to deal with. We had a lawyer in Bahrain where the government did exactly this to him, where they published the videos online, and we were able to work with Google and get all of those videos and so on, images removed from the internet. And I think in those cases, that should exist. People, private individuals, should have the right to be removed from the internet in that sense. And I think one last thing that I also wanted to add, when we're talking about, security and that, digital and data collection, one thing that we need to remember, Facebook, and especially if you have the Facebook or Instagram app on your phone, they're not just collecting data on you from what you post or what you click like on and so on. They actually have the capability of switching on your mic and listening to your conversations, and they pick up keywords that they use for advertisement purposes. I'm sure some of you have noticed that sometimes you're having a random conversation with someone, and then suddenly it starts showing up in your Facebook feed as an advertisement on that specific issue. And that's because there have been articles about this, and I do digital security training, so this is something I know as well. They have the capacity to listen in on your conversations even when you're not using the app, so even when you're not writing it on the app directly. And this is something that we also should need to keep in mind, when it comes to the ability of these companies to actually take the information or the things that we're doing to identify what they should and shouldn't show us on these apps or on these platforms.
Symone, have you seen a way in which social media and technology have been used in a positive way to kind of bring together this kind of disparate elements of people, or do you think we've gotten to the point where it's completely siloed?
No, the Women's March is a really great example. There were marches not just all across America, but across the world on January 21st, 2017. And that only happened because of the ability to organize cross platforms. And so it went viral via social media. I think back to, there was a case in Ferguson, Missouri. So everyone talks about the Black Lives Matter activists. And Ferguson, Missouri was the case of Michael Brown. And I remember where I was when I found out Michael Brown had been shot by Mike Schlager, the police officer. And I saw it on Twitter. I watched it unfold on social media. And so I do believe social media has the power to bring together movements. You know, now we have access, young activists today have access that, 50, 60 years ago, folks just did not have. The ability to see in real time how other people are organizing and activating in various spaces and places across the world. Concurrently, some other folks have that same access to enact some really negative and horrible and terrible things. So with anything, I think there's pros and there's cons to it, but we have to capitalize on the platforms where you can. But there is a real conversation to be had about the onus of these platforms to, in essence, regulate themselves. Like Facebook or Twitter never saw themselves as a news site. Neither did Instagram. But I'll tell you, I sit in focus groups all the time, and people, not even just young people, everybody from 18 to 55 are saying they get their news from Facebook. They get news from Twitter. They get news from Instagram. And so if folks are actively and readily identifying you as a news site, I would rather they say they get their news from CNNpolitics.com. But if they're saying they're getting their news from social media, there's some onus on these social media companies to act as an information czar, if you will, or a news czar, to ensure that they are delivering quality content to their users.
Neal, at what point does, I know that there was, my history on this is a little bit cloudy, but when things were determined public utilities like telephone companies or something like that, at what point do we, in the United States or around the world, where you have these private companies, they can do what they want, what point should the government go in and say, okay, you're too big, you're too important to people's lives, and therefore we're reaching in and we're going to start regulating you? I mean, right now in the United States, it seems like we're heading towards at least political ads on social media are going to be labeled from where they came from and sponsored and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly had a tradition of kind of too big to exist sometimes, and so, like Justice Brandeis argued, the banks should be broken up and things like that. I do think in the media space it's very difficult, though. I mean, because unlike railroads or other things, there's core speech going on, our First Amendment, rights of the press, and we're seeing this play out literally right now with the news reports that President Trump's administration is blocking the merger of AT&T and forcing the sale of your network, CNN, the network that he hates because he calls fake news. So it's a good example. Maybe there are some legitimate concerns behind the antitrust merger, but it gets wrapped into all this other stuff about speech. So it makes it an area in which the government, I think, has a lot of difficulty regulating, which is why I think Symone is absolutely right to focus on the voluntary actions of these companies. I mean, I think these companies at their core want to be good democratic players for the world stage. I don't think they're out there liking the fact that the Russians infiltrated them or that they're balkanizing us into different, segments of society. So I'd like to see that play out first before we start, getting into the realm of heavy government regulation.
And Maryam, why is there a business plus to being more to regulating hate speech online, or to being more of a promoter of these, like of a company getting more involved, rather than just saying, as Symone was saying, that these companies just say that they're blank walls, that they don't get involved? Is there, do you think, a business sense to this as well, beyond just being a good company?
Well, I mean, definitely there is. There's always a business sense to everything, right? Especially when it comes to private companies. But I think, generally where it becomes difficult is when you have something like Twitter, where even if you report someone and they get shut down, they can make 20 new accounts anyway, right? So then the question comes in of what is reporting even good for? And this is a problem that we've had because, the amount of trolls that I've had to deal with on Twitter, for example, is massive. And it gets tiring. After you've blocked, 10,000 people, you start getting tired of blocking people. And so there is this question of, one, is the company going to start, creating some sort of regulation of who can be on Twitter or not, which I think in and of itself might be problematic. And then the second question as well is, when you go and report these issues to the company, does the company even have the capacity to understand, one, what the claim is, and two, to deal with it? Because, for example, with Twitter, and this is one of the things that I was talking to them about, is, okay, so if you get a complaint from Bahrain about someone doing, extreme hate speech that might lead to violence that is sectarian, would you even have the capacity to understand what they're saying, to know or to determine if it's, something that needs to be taken down or not? And most of the time they don't, because they don't understand the context. And so one of the, the advice that we were giving them is that it would be great if they can actually set up a board of advisors or something like that of people from around the world who can give them that kind of information or understanding of the context so that they know how to deal with these situations. But very briefly on what Symone was saying as well in regards to like whether social media can be used for good or bad, I think we've learned the hard way in my case that social media is a double-edged sword. Because at the end of the day, social media was extremely important for our movements, in Bahrain, in Egypt, in Syria, and so on, because it was how we organized, it was how we communicated, it was how we documented the human rights violations. And when mainstream media stopped, covering what was happening in our countries, social media was how we made sure the world knew about us. And so it became extremely, extremely important. But at the same time, the government, as fast as we're learning how to use it, the government is also learning how to use it against us. And so they started their defamation campaigns using Twitter and Facebook. They started using it, to identify people for arrest and things like that. And which is also, why we're seeing this regulation of spyware right now being discussed at the EU Parliament. The decision's supposed to pass now in December, which I think is a great thing because, Denmark, for example, just recently we found out had allowed the selling by BAE Systems, the selling of mass surveillance technology to a country like Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia now has the capacity to survey the entire country based on keywords. So if anyone emails, for example, at amnesty.org, the Saudi government immediately knows and they get the identification of the IP address.
Wow, I did not know that. So I'm going to ask one last question, then open it up if any of you want to ask any questions of these amazing panelists. As you can tell, they know a lot. Symone, what kind of advice do you give to people and to also social media companies in terms of how to utilize tech to get out of your bubble? Because it's so easy to get sucked into it. And I know that there's new efforts. Wall Street Journal has an effort called Red Feed, Blue Feed that in the US you can go on and see what it looks like to be a conservative Facebook user or a liberal Facebook user. How have you yourself tried to get out of your bubble and interact with people more online?
I try to go, so Facebook and Twitter are really good examples, but so Twitter has, Twitter has hashtags.
Yeah.
And so I try to search various different hashtags. I try to go to, in a lot of the focus groups I've sat in, people will identify kind of what are their top news sources or their most top visited sites. And, I do really liberal focus groups and I've done some very conservative focus groups. And so I've kind of pulled in like a cadre of different sites and things that I can go to and check out, like, what is this other news that folks are consuming. But what I was sitting with some tech companies a couple months ago, and what I was encouraging them to do is to look, these advisory boards and committees are really, really helpful in putting together, like, what is your initiative? And so in terms of, how can companies look like they're doing a good job, like part of this is really, part of this is a PR thing, a public relations thing. Like, how can we present ourselves in a way that we are understanding all sides of what's going on and we are actively doing something about it. And so getting these little advisory boards together, and then from this hodgepodge of people, you put together some type of initiative which is kind of how the Wall Street Journal's Red Feed, Blue Feed thing came along. And I think that goes a long way in demonstrating to the greater public that there is a willingness and a want, if you will, on the company's part, on the tech company's perspective, to try and understand the totality of what's going on. But for people, I think it's just really important to understand that all of our social media sites, the things that we engage in every single day, reinforce what we think we know. And we don't really know a lot.
Right.
So it's really important to get out of what you think you know and go and learn something new.
Are there any questions out there? Yeah, we might have a microphone, but maybe not. Oh, right there.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'm actually the only barrister at this conference out of the whole world. I have two questions, one for Maryam, one for anyone else. Corporate responsibility as a, let's say, international norm, and also then sovereignty, state sovereignty. So for Maryam, like closing down Trump's Twitter page, we know it happened by accident last week, but I'd really love to hear how you would weigh that in the new kind of digital world against this standard of, state, head of state sovereignty in the international legal order. And then for the rest of the panel, just to what extent do you think the corporate responsibility framework or the milieu at the moment is fit for purpose to move forward this digitally context corporate responsibility? Thank you.
Maryam, you want to start?
So I think, realistically, it's not going to be shut down, right? I think we all know that. Twitter is not going to take down his account. But as a human rights defender, I think there needs to be a threshold of if he's actually trying to stoke war, and there's a high chance that North Korea might actually respond because of his tweets, with actual violence, then I think that is a discussion that needs to be had. I'm not saying that automatically means shutdown, because I think it's very dangerous to have a blanket decision, but I think there needs to be some sort of experts, looking into whether there is a need for it to be shut down and looking at, where the line needs to be when it comes to freedom of speech, what is freedom of speech and what is, a call for violence or what is hate speech and so on. So I think that's what needs to happen, in my opinion, as a human rights defender. And then the second thing, I think, I think we're now coming to a point in the world generally where we're coming past CSR and we're going into business and human rights. Because CSR, I think, to a large extent was about PR. It was about looking good. It was about companies, doing the bare minimum to make themselves look better. Business and human rights is about the SDGs. It's about companies actually respecting human rights and respecting, upholding, the standards of human rights and so on.
Here's a question, though, about the whole Donald Trump and Twitter thing, which I don't understand. Great if you want to turn off his account, but he's president of the United States. He can walk outside the White House doors and say the exact same thing, and we will cover it because he is president of the United States. So why even go through, why bother even trying to shut down his Twitter account?
If I may just very quickly, I think that with Twitter, what we need to realize is that when you're on Twitter and you're tweeting 140 characters, which now is apparently going to be turned to 280, it's a lot easier to say things that you're not necessarily always thinking through. And for someone like Donald Trump, we've seen this over and over
He does
again.
that when he's talking, though, too.
Yeah,
But Donald Trump is just as bad off Twitter as on Twitter, isn't he?
To a certain extent. For example, when the Qatar crisis happened, it took the U.S. military a long time to get through to him, to tell him, stop trying to take responsibility for the Qatar crisis. We have U.S. Military based in Qatar, so what are you doing? But if he was going to go out of the White House and make a statement, I think it would be a little different than him actually having his phone and just writing tweets.
If I may, I think maybe Donald Trump isn't the best example about someone that doesn't deserve a Twitter account, even though I think he should stop tweeting. But Milo Yiannopoulos is no longer on Twitter. Twitter shut his account down. If you know anything about Milo Yiannopoulos, he is a self-described, person of the alt-right, which I really believe is just white supremacy and khakis. But he no longer has a Twitter account because Twitter deemed that he was just too dangerous for the platform. Now, while I agree Milo Yiannopoulos should not have a Twitter account, let alone space in anybody's publication, I think we get into dangerous territory when we allow a certain group of people, whomever they are, whether they are experts or self-described experts, to decide who is deserving of what in which space. Because there used to be a point in time where we did have a certain group of people that decided in America who deserved what in which space. And those people locked everybody on this panel out. Unless you were a white man in America, you didn't have a certain set of actual rights, and you didn't deserve to be in a space. So history has a way of repeating itself, and I wonder if we are moving into a space to where we are actually talking about regulation online, but then there's a certain group of people that decide who gets what in which space online, and that certain group of people is not representative of the diversity of America and the world, actually.
So, sorry, go ahead. One last thing, and then...
comment very quickly. I think, on what you were saying, I agree with you that generally, if there was to be an advisory group, it would be an advisory group that was not representative. But what I would envision in, if we had a just and fair world, is that it would be a very diverse, representative diversity group. And I say this, the reason why I say this is necessary is because I've seen what it feels like, and I know what it feels like being on the receiving end of that hate speech, which doesn't necessarily directly link to violence, but the buildup of that hate speech. Like, for example, you can imagine, as a Muslim living in Europe and traveling to the United States, I've seen what it means to be labeled as a terrorist constantly, over and over and over again by the media, getting pulled out of security lines every single time I travel. Especially because my passport says I was born in Syria. So all of these different things, I know that, for example, when Charlie Hebdo puts a really, Islamophobic cartoon on the cover of their magazine, a lot of people say, well, that's freedom of speech. And I'm saying, well, that cartoon is what's going to get people to possibly attack me on the street for looking like a Muslim, even if they're not calling for violence. And so I'm not saying shut it down, but I think there needs to be a conversation about, again, and I know you understand this, of course, because it's the same thing, for people of color in the United States, is how do we draw a line between what is freedom of expression and what is speech that actually leads to violence against especially minority?
And the real question is freedom of expression in some instances also speech that could potentially lead to violence?
So the red light is flashing in my face, which means that we are well over time. But thank you all for coming. Clearly, there's a lot more to talk about here, so feel free to come up and talk to us. We'll be around, and enjoy the rest of your Web Summit.
Thank you.